Happy Saturday. So one of the things that I really try to drive home is that we exist not in a single moment of time. And who we are in a moment is not who we are forever or who we were. And that also other people, are not always fixed, in a moment. I've talked about this in different ways on the subreddit, but like, for example, recently I talked about celebrities, how we put them in a box and then we get very upset if they don't fulfill the role that their fans have decided that the celebrity needs to fill. They're stuck, static, and dehumanized in a sense by doing that. I've talked about this in terms of victims and abusers and an abuse dynamic. Often victims are perceiving an abuser a very specific way. It's a very static model of who that person is, and it doesn't get updated. The abuser's doing the same thing to the victim. The victim's supposed to be a certain way, and the abuser gets upset if the victim isn't that way. And I approach this concept in terms of like healing. Healing is a process. So like when people say stuff like, you're the only one who can make you happy. And you are very early on in your healing process. Like that is not helpful, that's hurtful. But when you're later on in your healing process, you're like, oh yeah, I can, yes, this is something that feels empowering and it's not a burden. It doesn't feel like I'm being made to be the blame for like this terrible experience that I've had. So our experience of life is not this static experience. Our experience of healing, our journey, our experience of people, of ourselves, which brings me to kind of this really hard question that someone asked on the subreddit. It's a comment to a post I made about how the most radical thing that Mr. Rogers ever did was to trust other people to be good people. And then when they weren't sometimes, he would often understand why they weren't. And there was a response which basically said, this is a thing that I really try to do and has ended up hurting me, except with my significant other. And I was like, yeah, I totally understand how that happened. I've talked about this in another video, but, victims of abuse really, really struggle with wanting to be good people. And so, I don't often see this talked about in other places, but someone named Isendai basically nailed it. She said, we're often trapped by our virtues and not our vices, so victims of abuse are always, not always, but often really struggling with like, is it ethical for me to leave this person or think, decide they're a bad person? Is it ethical for me to, think they're an abuser? Like there's a whole moral axis that a lot of abuse resources don't really address. So what I would say is, it's very important to recognize that we are on a spectrum, right? Just like biologically, we are on a timeline. We're on a spectrum. We start off as children, and then we become old, decrepit, and we die. And as we go on this journey, we start off knowing nothing, and then we build an identity, and then we hit a point where everything related to that identity is then like taken away from us. So like things that we think of in terms of how we look or what we're capable of or whatever, like slowly as we get older, gets stripped away until we become, empty again in a sense. And we don't have everything we built our identity on. Not our capacities, not how we looked, not, even our relationships, like people will be gone. So it's this like really kind of interesting journey that we take as human beings. And what I would say is that we need to not expect from ourselves things earlier in the journey that might make sense later in the journey, while still understanding that we are wanting to be moral, ethical, good people. So if you are early on in your journey, you're learning some really important basics. So if you're a victim of abuse or trauma or something, you're learning, oh, I don't know how to identify unsafe people. And often on the subreddit, I don't say like abusers. Sometimes I use language like toxic people or unsafe people, because when we get into that victim abuser paradigm, people sometimes struggle because they have a person in front of them that they love. And they're like, well, they're not an abuser. I'm not a victim. They're just someone who's dealt with a lot and they're really struggling. And so if you can change up the language, sometimes that can help. So sometimes if you go, oh, but okay, I get it, they're unsafe, or this is a toxic dynamic, or something, to kind of like plant those seeds. So anyway, the very, very first thing, I talk about this in my phases of healing. The very, very first phase is like stop the harm, getting away from the person who's harming you. Basically you can't heal if someone's still stabbing you. So you gotta stop the stabbing. But then you get to a point where you go, oh, okay, now I've got to figure out like what happened to me, how to keep myself safe, who am I now? What was this experience that I went through? And so what's really important at that phase of things is knowing how to keep yourself safe, knowing how to recognize danger. There comes a point later in our process of growing and our journey where we may be able to pull a Mr. Rogers, to deal with somebody in front of us and seeing them wholly on a human level. It's a very difficult thing to do, and that's why we so respect people who are able to do it, who in the face of being demonized, villainized, harmed, whatever, can still look at that other person, right? And say, I see you as a human being, and even though you are harming me, and you may even kill me, I'm going to treat you as if there is humanity in you, and that I see good in you, and maybe you'll rise up to that. And if not, I understand why you didn't. Like that's some over here shit. That's not over here shit. As I've kind of been outlining on the subreddit recently, it's important for us to recognize that people are people, and to maintain our concept of them as a human being. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think that there aren't bad people. Bad people do exist. I had an example of one of those last night. Yeah, and bad people often don't even realize that they're bad people or don't think that they're bad people. So, it's kind of like, it's a really important tool to recognize. Just like if you're looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like the basic is like shit that preserves your life, and then like security. And so these are really important tools to have. But no matter what happens, still understanding like this person isn't a monster, they aren't unhuman, they are a person. They may be a bad person, but they're still a person. We gotta see like a whole person there. That's why I've talked about Trump the way that I have. Do I think Trump is a good person? No. But do I think Trump is a person? Yes, he's a whole person. And his supporters have treated him like he is not a person, but they have elevated him. And his detractors have treated him like he's not a person, and they've demonized him. And it's like, no. We can recognize he is a person, and also go, okay, you've done some not okay things, but you've had some things happen to you. Like, let's have a more global, comprehensive, balanced perspective of what's happening here. And it doesn't mean that you can't have like the feelings you feel. So there's this sort of like there's this idea that is kind of prevalent in a lot of different areas in our society. I typically refer to it on the subreddit as the Beauty and the Beast trope, but it's literally like, I've been doing Bible study and it's in the Bible. Like, it's this idea is thousands of years old, which is that a person, through the goodness of themselves, can transform someone else. You know, that's a part of, you know, why we've seen, with Gandhi, you know, nonviolence, my brain, you know, when they showed up with the British, like prepared to die, and to force the British into taking such violent, you know, dehumanizing, killing action towards other people who clearly were not fighting back, and to force them to face their own humanity and what they're doing. You know, that is an incredibly powerful tool. But that is to expect that of ourselves all the time is not reasonable. You know, if that's a thing that we choose to do, like, great, and that we're in a place where we're making that choice in a healthy way, like, I get it. But a lot of victims of abuse will, you know, go, oh, I see this unsafe. I see this unsafe person. I understand how they got that way. I see the good in them. You know, I want to support that, et cetera, et cetera. And the problem is that Mr. Rogers is not in a relationship with any of these people that he's doing that with. He's not choosing to fill his inner circle with people that he feels challenged to see the good in, right? So he sees, you know, let's say he sees the good in everybody, but he's not filling his inner circle with people that he's challenged to do that with. Because how could anybody be safe? How could anybody have a healthy relationship that way? How would you raise children in that environment? You know, they're learning all sorts of wrong ass lessons. Pardon my language. But, you know, sometimes those of us who've particularly grown up in like not safe situations, we don't have concepts of gradations of relationships. That you have like your most inner core relationship with yourself, or like, you know, like a spiritual situation, and then, you know, you're like family, and then like your very, very close friends, and then your friends and your acquaintances, and blah, blah, blah. And like people, you know, they kind of show up in their respective areas. And so what you can do is you can kindly and lovingly set boundaries with people. So you might have somebody in an outer layer, or a random person you meet on the street, and be able to see them as the good person that they might be somewhere. But that doesn't mean you let them in and give them an opportunity to hurt us, right? That's also helpful for them. We're not going to give them an opportunity to perpetrate harm on another human being. If you're Gandhi, that harm is already occurring, so that method of protest can be effective. But if you are not in a situation where that is happening and is not a part of your methodology or strategy for protecting yourself, I would personally feel that it's not good to allow somebody to harm you, right? Because it's an offensive. It's an offense against the self, ultimately. Yes, it's an offense against the victim. But if you are, you know, if you're a person who kills, if you're a person who rapes, if you're a person who beats, if you're a person who, you know, does any of these things, you're harming yourself on a really core level. Because in order to do those things, you have to dehumanize other people. You have to disconnect. So you're depriving yourself of relationships, of attachment. You know, even people that are, I want to say, is it sociopathic? They can intellectually grasp the concept of empathy. They can intellectually understand, like, okay, here's my place in society. They don't necessarily feel a need to harm other people. So I'm not saying those people don't exist anywhere, but you know, everyone on some level can understand that we exist in a community, and our job is not to harm the people in our community. And so we don't want to participate in that if we can, by creating situations where someone might be able to do that, because that goes against who they are and is harmful to us. There's harm on both sides. It's no one's job to rescue another person. Not only is it no one's job to rescue another person, it's absolutely impossible unless you're dealing with like children. For the most part, you know, a lot of victims of abuse, and I've been there. I've super been there. You know, where I'm just like, oh my gosh, I wish someone would just come along and just like fix everything. And the people who are willing to do that want it on their terms. And then we'll be upset if you're not grateful. And then most people are not willing to do that. And then even if people are willing to do that, the victims aren't necessarily like, you know, wanting that. We have to rescue ourselves, generally speaking. You know, I mean, once you get to like really extreme levels, like, yes, okay, yes, this works. But if you're voluntarily in a relationship with a person and you can leave, but it's more an emotional thing, we're not talking about children. We're not talking about like you're with somebody who's locking you in a cage. Like, not any of that. We're talking about like your more kind of more common standard romantic abusive relationships, or even like with your parents as an adult. You know, there's that picture of it's this lady, she's on her knees and she's like so sad and she's holding on to this string. And the guy's holding the other end of it. He's walking away and he's like on his phone or ignoring her or something. And she's sobbing and she's got scissors in her hands, but she won't cut it. You know, she won't cut the string between them. Like that's typically a lot of what you see. Again, I'm not laughing because it's funny. I'm laughing because I've fucking been there. You know, looking back, I'm like, what are you doing? You know, a lot of what underpins victims in an abuse dynamic is their desire to change another person. And I think that's probably the difference between the Mr. Rogers thing and a victim of abuse. Mr. Rogers is not trying to change people. He gives them the opportunity to show up. And then if they don't, he exercises compassion. Victims of abuse, on the other hand, are hoping to transform another person into being a good person. Like, it's unintentionally coercive. It's trying to make another person do something instead of respecting, like, oh, that's where you're at, okay. And that, I'd say, is what the difference is. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm gonna talk to you next time.